shortly. We win the presidency, we win the Senate, we come very close to winning the House. There will maybe still be a Republican guard. I don't assume that that's going to be the case, but you will have Republicans in the House, some of them so frightened that with what's happening, that they will not defy things that the public has shown it wants. They won't defy sensible immigration policy, or equality for LGBT people, or an increase in the minimum wage. One of the great things about the hearing, even the Republicans have now agreed that you have to talk not just about overall economic growth, but how it's distributed. But I have to say that because overall economic growth in the United States in the last 7.5 years is the best in the world, in the developed world. So how do they avoid acknowledging Barack Obama's singular economic success, or you want to phrase it one more tweet, the great economic success that America has had, despite, according to them, all these terrible things like healthcare, financial reform, equal rights for women, etc. And they now have had to say, well, it's not being fairly shared. That people haven't focused on the significance of this. You have the Republican candidates now saying, well, the middle class, working people have been left out. I'm glad they're saying it, because here's the problem. How do you argue that we have an economy in which not enough has been done for lower income people, and then say, by the way, let's cut taxes on the very rich? Let's not pay for minimum wage. Let's re-deregulate derivatives so they can go back to having fun and cut back on health care. That's what's so important. But one of the things that the Republican leadership is upset about is that Donald Trump, for all of his faults, at least understands that cutting Social Security doesn't make any sense, moral, political, or economic. And he's kind of called them out on this, so they're in trouble. So if we do this right, we win. And here's what I am very encouraged by. We're in a vicious cycle where people are angry at government, many of them, because government hasn't produced. And so they then vote for the people who also hate government, who then get in power and make sure we can't produce. We have to break that cycle. If we elect Hillary Clinton and a Democratic Senate and a strong Congress, House that's at least willing to listen to reason, we're going to be able to reintroduce the American people to things that are in their benefit. And that's going to happen. Final steps needed for full legal equality for LGBT people. Start with the Supreme Court. Many of us voted for something called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act because we wanted to protect religious people from others telling them what they couldn't do. The right wing has now turned this into a way of telling other people what they shouldn't do, not because of their religion. For lawyers, it's a distinction between a shield and a sword. The shield in the legal metaphor is something that protects you against people who want to invade your sphere. A sword is a weapon that you can use to invade other people's sphere. They've transmogrified the Religious Freedom Restoration Act when the vote was 5-4. And the fifth vote for that, obviously, was the late Justice Scalia. And I have to say that one sign that we haven't yet reached full cultural equality is that when Justice Scalia died, the fact that he was one of the most important devout homophobes in American high office wasn't noted. If he had been as comfortably bigoted on racial grounds or gender grounds or religious grounds, it would have been noticed. And people wonder how they can make such a big deal, against racists like Richard Russell. Well, in 20 years, people are going to wonder, hey, how come nobody noticed that Scalia not only voted that the Constitution didn't protect us from prison if people were having consenting sex, but he thought it was a good idea. He compared it to murder, that he talked about how terrible we were. But the new Supreme Court Justice, in the first place, will reverse that terrible distortion of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and not allow people's rights to be denied. Beyond that, of course, at the state level, we had the moral argument against allowing people to invoke their religion to deny us our rights. They're entitled to whatever they want to do in their own religious activity. But it's always been the rule that if you run a business, you don't just run a business on your own. You got to get a license. There's zoning issues. any business that opens in most parts of the country comes at the expense of others that might have been there. And with that has come the accommodation to serve the public as long as the public is well behaved. So they've asked to be able to make an exception for that for reasons of prejudice against some of us. Now, we've been fighting that moral argument, and we were kind of doing okay on the moral side. But, you know, like a cheesy Western, which the cavalry rides to the rescue of these people who the Indians are trying to keep from taking more of their land. We have had a cavalry ride to our rescue. It's the profit motive. You know, we're in a tough fight about morality, and now the business community comes in and says, hey, keep your prejudice out of my business, because I want to make as much money as possible. And here's what the business community is telling them. You are giving me a right I never asked for. You are giving me the right to discriminate against people based on their sexual orientation and gender identity. I don't want that, because if I do that, either I do discriminate and they get mad at me, or I don't discriminate and you get mad at me. I want to be able, that's a decision I don't want to make. We all have that now. I thought, don't put that on me. By the way, I learned early on, I don't know about Jim and David, first grade members of Congress, but
I'm so short.
I learned don't do a favor for someone who didn't ask for it. The woman called my office and said her daughter was about to get married to a guy who was in the Army and was about to be shipped overseas before the wedding. Could I stop it? I said, yeah, let's try to do that. So we called the Army. The Army called back and said, well, you know, Privacy Act and everything like that, of course, you can't make the request on his behalf. If he makes it, you can support it. The next call I got was from the soldier in question, and he said, will you mind your own goddamn business? He was not interested in my protecting his ability to get married. I really learned that lesson. That's a true story and a true lesson. So we can win this, and then we'll have further legislation, and clearly the country is with us, and people understand that, because the reason is, and this is why ultimately, by the way, we're going to win on the transgender issue on bathroom. I spoke recently with the comment, asked what I've often asked audiences when people say, well, isn't there a problem having unisex bathrooms? And my question is, would everybody in this room who lived in a house now on the issue, yes, Bernie Sanders has voted with us, but it is not an accident. Well, I mean, that just Sanders benefited from a while from not having food. By the way, if he weren't being the nominee, I would have enthusiastically campaigned for him. But that's not a question, and I wish he would show the same true picture. The notion, the argument that he'd be a stronger candidate because the polls show him now stronger. In the first place, maybe he believed that nobody else does. The Republicans have made clear that they wish they could run against him. Two things. First of all, nobody's really focused on his record, and they focus excessively on Hillary. Beyond that, and here's the key, if you ask Clinton supporters who they will vote for, Sanders, Trump, or Sanders, Cruz, quite sensibly, almost everybody says Sanders. If you ask the Sanders people how they would vote, Clinton, Trump, Clinton, Cruz, a third of them now are saying they'll vote for Trump or Cruz. Now that explains this statistical anomaly, because most of them are not going to do that in the end, and there will be people who will point this out. It also is an indication of why I am troubled by his mode of campaigning, which is, I am the only honest person in politics. And if you do not backs away now he's confronted. One of the questions I'm going to ask you, I'll be on Lawrence O'Donnell tomorrow night. I'll ask you that. He talks about how you cannot be seriously committed to change if you've taken money from the financial industry or from other industries. He's talked about how you have a PAC, then you're morally flawed. I want to ask him, can he name any other significant political figure in America other than himself who meets his standard? The answer is no. I will tell you that my colleague and the greatest advocate for social justice in America, Ted Kennedy, would fall far short of his standard. And the press talked about how no senator was supporting Ted Kennedy. Well, until recently, no senator was supporting Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders has been in Congress. This is his 26th year. And he has virtually no support. He's up to 5 members of the House now. There are about 70 members combined of the Congressional Black Caucus, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, and lesbian and gay members. I'm not talking about the caucus, but those of us who are lesbian and gay. Of that, approximately 70 members, 2 are for Bernie Sanders, a handful are neutral, and more than 60 are for Hillary Clinton. Virtually every member of Congress who has worked hard for progressive change. Jim talked about people with disabilities. The hero of that movement is Senator Tom Harkin, who campaigned strongly for Hillary in Iowa. And I had somebody say, well, that's the establishment. Yeah, the establishment figures like John Lewis, who was beaten to death by the Bears, and Martin Hewitt. On immigration, Kevin Dave's colleague Luis Gutierrez, who's been the most militant, taking on presidents, going to jail on behalf of a decent immigration policy. Tammy Baldwin, who was brave enough to run and win the first openly gay or lesbian person to win before she got elected many years ago. So it is overwhelming. It's not the establishment. And then it's the Human Rights Campaign. It's Planned
Parenthood.
Every organization that knows how to change things. Now, I agree. Bernie Sanders articulates some very strong values. But that's all he does. You know, there was this, I'm a great believer in free speech. I once said at a Democratic conference, I think Jim and Dave were there, when some people were worried that the hate crimes, we were extending hate crimes to LGBT people, particularly transgender people who were the most frequent victims of those hate crimes. And some of the people said, well, their clergy were worried that if we passed that, they'd be inhibited from preaching against homosexuality. And my point was, I was chairman of the Financial Services Committee at the time, that I'm not in favor of restricting any speech, even so-called hate speech. Hate speech is speech. I mean, you know, you gotta understand, if you're for free speech, that includes defending the right of assholes to say obnoxious things. People don't try to censor nice speech. But I pointed out that if the bill became law tomorrow, it would still be perfectly legal for people to call me a fag. I did note that I wouldn't recommend it to anybody in the banking business, but that was down in that. Would make it illegal if I was going to make an exception for people to treat pragmatism and idealism as a separation. You run into people, oh, you can be for, look, you're a pragmatist, but I'm an idealist. Well, yeah, you ought to start with your ideals. But the more you are seriously committed to your ideals and really believe they should be implemented, then the greater is your moral obligation to care about implementing them. To be pragmatic. Morally superior. And that's all I do. Hillary Clinton has the support of virtually everybody in the national Congress and in national politics who have been working for effective change. Because she understands that it's not just enough to articulate it, but that you have to do things. And sometimes that means compromising. And yes, I once was debating Ralph Nader. We got irritated with him, and as he was denouncing something we were accomplishing, which was a great advance, I forget which one it was, because it didn't meet his standards of absolute perfection, I told him that he was luxuriating in the purity of his irrelevance. He's been a senator for 26 years, but he luxuriates. And he gives himself the credit for advocacy without getting things done. And by the way, you saw that when we get to the banking situation. One of his aides complained that I said he was confused in his answer to the New York Daily News. And he said, oh, that was a terrible remark. And I was basically saying he wasn't qualified because he was too old. Because if you say someone is confused, you're suggesting that he is too old. My easiest response was that very few 76-year-olds denounce a 74-year-old for being too old. But here is the problem. By the way, front page New York Times yesterday. People talk about the living wills, etc. That's the second line of defense. That's after they get in trouble. The first line of defense in that bill is to make them stop doing the things to get them in trouble in the first place. Yeah. Not to make a bad loans, not to get involved in which you sell credit default swaps contracts and don't have the money to back them up and know how much you put in there. And if you read the New York Times yesterday, what it says is the banks are getting back to banking. There's less razzle-dazzle. They have to have more capital if they do it. They have to put up margin. The fact is that they are much less likely to have to get into the legal. That doesn't mean we stop. And by the way, while I'm here, and I talk about the great work Jim and David do, and I'm a great admirer of Senator Whitehouse.
Yes.
But one of the people who had the greatest positive input into the financial reform bill was Jack Reed. Jack was a very important advocate. But here's the key, and you can tell people, Bernie Sanders said we're going to break up the banks. I don't know if you saw Saturday Night Live yesterday. Asked him as a New Yorker, Myron David, how are you going to break up the bank? Well, I'll have a good schwitz, and then I'll sit down and I'll talk to the banks, and yada, 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 they'll be broken up. It's confirmed the view that I have, that the hardest job in the world is, in America, on politics this year, is being a Saturday night. We can't make fun of this crap. It's funnier than reality, isn't it? Basically, Myron David just said what Sanders said. I'll give you one example. He says the answer is to break up the banks because they are too big. I have asked him a dozen times in public and in print, how big? He won't say. Now, how can you say that the answer is that they are too big, but they won't tell you how big is too big? What number? Is it a trillion? Is it 500 billion, etc.? The reason, by the way, is that the number they would have to make would be so small as to be disruptive. In fact, as the New York Times said, as Paul Krugman has said, Hillary Clinton understands that law, understands how it's working, is ready to make it work even better, and her chief advisor on this is a man named Gary Gensler, who is the head of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the key derivative regulator. You talk to anybody who follows this. He is as tough a regulator as America has ever had. He was an obvious tough to do.